I'd like to welcome our first panel of government and policy leaders to discuss how do we close this equity gap. So welcome everyone, and thank you for participating in this important conversation. I'd like to start with each of our panel members introducing themselves. So Charisse, I'm going to call on you to start us off.
Fantastic. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here. My name is Charisse Conanan Johnson, and I am a managing partner at Next Street, where we work with the private and public client base to make sure more capital and more capabilities and more customers get to entrepreneurs and small businesses, particularly those who are systemically held back. I grew a tech business here as a Black female and recent author of a book called A Wealthy Girl, which one of the steps is around how do we support and invest in small businesses.
Saudia, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. Absolutely. It's my joy and pleasure. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an executive producer and infrastructure builder, and it is my pleasure to serve as the director for the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship, which empowers creatives at all levels with the knowledge, skills, relationships necessary for business success. Inspired by the legacy of 2112 and Fort Knox Studios, we are a centralized hub of 160,000 square feet built to address what was Chicago's fragmented creative sector. I'm happy to be here with you, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate.
Thanks for being here. And Kristi, please introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, thank you for having me here today as well. So Kristi Dula, the head of the Office of Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Technology at Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. So we focus on resources that are available for startups and small businesses throughout the state. And prior to this role, which ties into this community here, I was a founding member of the 1871 team in 2012, and then went on to work for PGVC recently. So have kind of tapped into the different aspects of the ecosystem here and excited to be here today.
Terrific. Well, ladies, welcome, and I'm going to kick it right off as we only have a short amount of time. So I'll ask you to keep your answers a little bit brief, but we've got a lot to cover. So my first question is for Charisse. Last year, Next Street published a report that assessed the gap between the availability of and demand for equity and equity-like capital among small and medium-sized businesses owned by people of color in Chicago. Charisse, can you share a couple of insights from that report on the funding gap?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. Just so everyone knows, that report was commissioned by Benefit Chicago, which is a collaboration of the MacArthur Foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, and the Calvert Foundation. And that's important given the public and private sector stakeholders needed to help close the gap. And what we found is that 57% of the population in broader Cook County is Black and Latinx. However, small businesses that they own only represent 9%, and those are with employees. And that only generates only 6% of revenues. So there's a gap there. And when it comes to the equity capital gap, Black and Latinx founders and entrepreneurs seek over $180 million in equity financing. However, they only get 46% of that financing here in Chicago alone. That gap is staggering, and putting some parameters around that is super important. And how do we close that gap? And obviously you heard from Madam Pritzker around some of the initiatives already being formed and launched over the last year. But I think it's important to talk about the solutions, and that's what we talked about in that paper. One is, how do we have more representation at the GP and LP level? Chicago Blend also working there as well. Two, this is not a moral charity case. This is about business innovation and about innovation. Number three, how do we have the right product mix in terms and product structure such that it's not just also about venture funding to some of these small businesses and entrepreneurs, but revenue-based financing that also might help these businesses grow. And then finally, how do we make sure we have that right family and friends capital? And so those are some of the key findings of that paper to help solve that gap.
Thank you, Charisse. Kristi, Help me understand, what role can the city and the state play in supporting diverse founders and solving for these gaps? And what resources already exist?
Yes, so there's many ways the government can play a role here. One would be in implementing policies that produce equitable outcomes, also enabling equitable access to capital. So that's currently being done by the Illinois Treasurer's Office with the Illinois Growth and Innovation Fund, a $1 billion impact investment fund through the office, which is focused on investing in more diverse founders. Also, the Angel Tax Credit Program is a $10 million tax incentive program to incentivize investments in early stage startups. And with some adjustments we made to the program this last year, we were able to increase the investments leveraged by minority-owned startups by nearly 1,500% year-over-year growth last year, and increase investments leveraged for women-owned startups by over 150%. We can also be building business capabilities, and facilitating knowledge sharing and expanding opportunities for mentorship and sponsorship. So last year, the Pritzker administration directed $19 million in investments to small business development centers throughout the state, which actually helped to increase financing for minority-owned small businesses by 89%. And those centers, the network of 42 centers throughout the state, is also providing services in over 15 languages statewide. Diversifying our own supplier pool, which is being done by the state as well with the Business Enterprise Program. And I think advocating for change in federal programs that might be beneficial for diverse founders as well. And some of those examples are including sole proprietors as eligible applicants for PPP and other programs that they could leverage, and also including ITIN numbers. That was another issue that we were having as far as not being able to use an ITIN number before. So now that has changed, and that's been very helpful.
Thank you, Kristi. Saudia, from the private sector perspective, how does the Center for Creative Entrepreneurs engage communities of color, and what are you hearing from founders in terms of the challenges they have around access to capital or other challenges?
Absolutely, thank you. We maintain a focus on equity and ensuring our programs engage BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and other historically marginalized spaces in the creative entrepreneurs. The Center for Creative Entrepreneurship was only established last February, and in that time we created 75 original programs, 590 free educational programs where we amplify 80% of our programmatic partners, intentionally curating the gap of 20%. We awarded 12 diversified scholarships, and we reach about 850,000 through social media. Now, when we talk, going into 2021, it became very clear that actually as doors to capital and opportunities started to fly open within the creative sector, and we're talking about creative tech at the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship, it became very important to actually find out from founders what their needs are, to ensure that they understand the responsibility to capital and to be accountable for those funds. So we started a resource roundtable to find out their experience. And I can tell you there were two glaring outcomes. One was, individuals not having favorable experiences with banks. And two, we have these certifications that could be perceived as barriers to entry when a minority business owner may want to apply for a particular contract that comes through the city or through, a particular region. And so individual entrepreneurs are spending money in order to get a consultant to fill out those applications for success. And I'll say one extra thing, and this is important, is vocabulary became very important. When we talk about risk tolerance, right? Do you have $10,000 to put into your own company. Or you mentioned earlier, family fund rounds. How many individuals have family members that they can go to for that initial startup capital of $10,000? So it became really important to understand and sort of level set the playing field. And once we did identify through that resource roundtable what founders' needs are, then we actually curate intentionally programs and educational resources to meet that need.
That's very interesting. My next question for all of you, we've talked about some of the challenges that are being faced by our entrepreneurs, but there's, tremendous potential for economic development outcomes from increasing our investment in early stage diverse founders. And maybe I could ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Kristi, what do you see as those potential opportunities?
Yes, I agree. There are great opportunities ahead if we really focus our efforts in the right spaces here. So I think we could see an increase in jobs created and retained, and in addition, probably an increase in average salary for diverse individuals and for the businesses owned by the diverse founders. Building inclusive environments also increases the appeal for diverse founders. So I would also anticipate that we would be able to see higher business attraction and retention rates throughout the state and more diverse rates, which is exciting as well. I think we might see more diverse founders after exits starting to move into investor roles, which I think is very interesting because then we start to see more investments being made in more diverse businesses when there's more executive leadership that's diverse at venture funds as well. And I think it's worth noting with everything I mentioned previously and this part as well, that to make this work, the goals must be set, metrics must be tracked, and delivery must be intentional and consistent. So it can't just be kind of throwing things at a wall here. We all need to be collaborating with each other, and we all need to be on the same page as to the path that we're trying to move forward on here.
Well, your point about targets of success, and we'll get to that in a minute, but also the need for collaboration and community and working together and breaking down all the silos is, one of the big objectives of TechRise. Saudia, do you have other thoughts you want to add on the issue of economic development and outcomes?
Absolutely. One of the things when the pandemic hit is the entire creative sector went to a halt. And not a lot of people really, even Congress had to look at funding opportunities to catch those gig economy participants. But I will say two things. One, I do want to point out Invest Southwest, which was an initiative launched out of this administration's office at the theater, the Conanan Center for the Arts, which I had the pleasure of building. But I want to take a look at some numbers because this is very important. Chicago is the third largest movie and recording workforce in the country. And listen to this, $698 billion in Illinois film economy, $560 million in film spending, and since 2012, film spending has increased 15% annually. 20% growth rate in Illinois film industry since 2019. And what that means is I have an example. With the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship, we were launched and we are in part funded by the Coleman Foundation. And as everyone knows, once the pandemic hit, the industry stopped, but we were all forced to go inside. Well, I felt a deep obligation to meet the requirements of our fund. And so I needed to create our educational panel discussions that were in person into a virtual space. We're talking about the increase in technology that met the demand of what was happening, but we still had to create networking. How was that going to happen? It ended up happening through the back end of StreamYard. We always, with the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship in any industry, I think it's important in terms of pathways and pipelining individuals into success that we have leadership involved. And I am here to share that Lisa Mezer of Tessa Films networked with an emerging diversified scholar, Chan Smith, and ended up hiring Chan to shoot her first commercial here in Chicago. Very exciting, but here's the thing. That pipeline, we have to find ways to make it happen, even in technology. And if I could share one more thing really quickly, because this goes to access to capital. industry is an emerging platform that literally is at the forefront of where entertainment is going. The cable bundling has fallen apart and everybody's seen Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, right? Well, the next thing is watchable, shoppable, social. Now, industry has 2 leading female founders, but the venture capitalists and those are still trying to catch up and have yet caught up with the merge of the technology and investing in these new and emerging founders. And that's critical because industry could be first right out of Chicago.
Terrific. Charisse, I'm going to turn to you and maybe with our final question, and you can comment on the previous question in this together, which is really, how do we measure success over the next decade? How do we know what's working for our Black and Latinx founders? And so maybe you could kick off that and any other comments.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, because what we're really trying to get at, which is what you started with, is how do we close the racial wealth gap is one big, right, ambitious goal that we all can circle around. And small business owners, the median net worth of families with a small business owner is 5 times the median net worth of families with regular employees. And so we begin to build the wealth cushion as well as passing on that intergenerational wealth to the next generation. It's not just about us, it's about the next generation. So that's point 1. Number 2, 68% of every $100 spent at a local business stays in the community. And you shared with us that when you have a Black or Latinx owner, they tend to hire more, right? And Kristi said that as well. So we have this wealth and ripple effect happening in our communities that matters. I also want to point out that the outcomes and the economic development goals should be about the shifting landscape of power. This is about who's at the table to make decisions. And this is about tackling racism right at its heart. It's money and power go hand in hand. And so I want to see the outcomes that drive toward chipping away and kicking, I would say, down the doors of racism. I would also like to point out when we have more Black and Latinx founders, and particularly women, and shout out to the women on this panel because you guys are phenomenal. Black women specifically are the fastest growing pre-COVID segment within people of color and within gender. And that matters because American Express did a study that showed that when the revenue of businesses owned by women of color reach that of their white women counterparts, 4 million net new jobs are created and over $980 billion in revenue would be added to the economy. It matters. It matters who's doing the innovation. It matters also who's coming out. When you have these more diverse founders, you have more philanthropists, you have more investors. Everybody benefits. We start to break down the violence happening in our city. So this is all connected back to other sectors of the economy, and that's really what I want to leave. It's imperative. We don't want any more separate and unequal. That is not going to work, and we have to have an integrated model.
Well, I think everybody on this call today agrees with that. And as your point is, we have to be both intentional and extremely focused on the outcomes. Kristi, you want to add final thoughts about outcomes and success?
Sure, and I will note, I just love the passion on this panel, so I appreciate all that you're bringing here because this is just a great conversation. Thank you. I think in addition to that, I would agree with all that Charisse just said and add, I think we want to be very intentional about tracking ROI for investors so that we're able to really show that this does move the needle. This is very important. And I think tracking GDP, consumer spending, business investment overall, government spending, employment figures, and business attraction and retention rates is very important. And breaking that down into not just the minority subset, but really like which minorities. So we've got Black, Latinx, and Hispanic, and that's very important because I think that sometimes it's all lumped together and then it actually does some of the minorities a disservice because it's not actually telling the whole story of what it's like for these communities. So I think tracking this and continuing to move forward will be a great movement for us all.
I think that monitoring data like that, and particularly outcomes, return on investment, and through various investment types and who we're investing with, is really essential. We need to blow up the myth that Black and Latinx founders can't perform. We need to blow that up, and we need to put it away and demonstrate that that is simply a myth. And so I think that's something very important that we have to do with this group. Saudia, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, great. I'm going to make it fun. I once heard that diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance, right? So, Charisse and Kristi just hit on it. Equity and inclusion can only be as successful as the metrics show. And I think it's important that we get granular about it. And what I mean by that, and thank you, Kristi, for bringing this up, the pie charts, right? When we see X amount percentage of women, X amount of percentage of Black-owned companies, of the Black-owned, are women in there? Are Black women in the women number? And when we get really granular, it's important so that we really understand, Penny Pritzker, to what you just said, we can track these things. Now, the last thing that I will say, and I say this to individuals, to my founders out there, if you do not see yourself in the room or at the table, you're missing. And it means that you need to be there, because your voice is important, your stories are incredible. And I mean, listen, I've got a penny, by the way, on, because every penny counts, every cent counts. I told that to Tyler Perry, it was quite funny. But the point is whatever industry we're talking about, it's important that everyone is at the table. We are so much stronger when we work together. Thank you so much to TechRise, Verizon, and for giving us all an opportunity for the Finzen family to be Chicago.
I just want to say, what a phenomenal panel. I hope everybody agrees. You guys are fantastic. Thank you so much for making the time and for sharing your energy, your passion, your ideas with all of us on the call. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Make it a great day.